Welcome to Empires and Ecologies of the Cloud, the second of our end-to-end exchange sessions. I am going to just briefly introduce our moderator, Daphne Dragona, who is a curator and writer based here in Berlin. She holds a PhD from the Faculty of Communication and Media Studies of the University of Athens. And she engages with various topics and practices and methodologies that challenge contemporary forms of power. Among our topics of interest have been the controversies of connectivity, the promises of commons, the challenges of artistic subversion, the instrumentalization of play, the problematics of care and empathy, and most recently, the potential of kin-making technologies in the time of climate crisis. And of course, Daphne was also a part of the program team of Transmediale in the years from 2015 to 2019, working mainly as a curator of the conference. And for the 2020 festival, she also formed part of the team of curatorial advisors for the Eternal Network exhibition. And I'm very glad that you're moderating this session, because it also, of course, thematically connects to the themes and projects that you brought into play for the exhibition and also in your contribution to the Eternal Network book. So please welcome Daphne and later also the speakers of this session.
Thank you, Christopher, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon. I'm here to moderate this afternoon session. We're here to discuss the empires and the ecologies of the cloud, and to particularly reflect upon the costs, their impact on a societal but also environmental level. And this is, of course, of great interest because the last 10, 20, or 30 years, depending on the generation, let's say, that each one of us in this theater belongs to, we as users experience different forms of online communication, from joining lists, forums, and chats, to using social platforms and apps. And as online communication passed from decentralized to centralized architectures, users turned in a way from endpoints, from nodes in a network, to data points for today's networks. And when this change happened, data, of course, started being generated with almost every move, every request or interaction within an ecosystem of platforms, while a record of one's performance and personalized results, feeds, and suggestions were generated in return. So processes of datafication and quantification started in a way organizing life, and this is something that, of course, we have also discussed in Transmediale in the past, but they also opened the way to forms of surveillance and commodification. And the cost of connectivity and the comfort, let's say, that it involves, it became apparent that it very much lies in the exploitation of social resources, which subsequently connects with the exploitation, of course, of natural resources for the needs of the technical infrastructures where data is being stored. And this is a reference to the impact that out-of-sight clouds of the big tech have on the environment, as well as on the technological fixes, the solutions that nowadays are being proposed. So what happens, we might want to ask, in the framework of this panel, when the big tech companies promise to organize not only life, but also nature? How our zones and territories, users and workers, are definitely being affected? And most importantly, of course, what can be done to confront and decolonize this extractivist model of today's networks? Is it at all possible to reimagine the internet as a network of networks, as a world of multiple worlds? So to address this question, we have with us two main speakers and three respondents that have greatly engaged with these topics, and I will introduce them progressively. I will now say a few words for Ulises Mejias, who will be our first speaker, who is an associate professor and director of the Institute for Global Engagement at SANI Oswego. His research interests include critical data studies, philosophy and sociology of technology, and political economy of digital media. Ulises has greatly discussed in his work the limitation of networks as organizational social systems. He's the author of the book Off the Network, Disrupting the Digital World, published in 2013 by the University of Minnesota Press. Last year, together with Nick Aldry, they wrote The Costs of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism, which is published by Stanford University Press. And I believe that this will also be the basis for his lecture this afternoon. Thank you very much, and please welcome Ulises Mejias.
Let's see. Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to be walking around a little bit. I am recovering from jet lag, and I figured if I walk, I will force myself to be awake and energetic, and also keep you awake. So thank you very much to the organizers of the festival. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of my work with you. I'm actually going to talk about both of my books a little bit. But I was intrigued by the initial question posed by the festival on whether network idealism is dead. I'm still not sure what network idealism is exactly, but I thought if it's dead, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Just anecdotally, I can tell you that maybe 5-10 years ago, when I was teaching my classes and I used to ask my students, don't you care that corporations are tracking you? Don't you care that the government is tracking you? That all of your data is being used in these ways? And the standard response, as I'm sure you've heard many people say as well, is I don't care. It's okay, I'm not doing anything wrong. Yes? So why should I care? I'm getting all of these free services, why should I care? Interestingly, that response has been changing, I would say, in the past 5 years. I'm assuming not just because of my teaching, but because the students are becoming more aware of certain dynamics. I would say actually that 3 things killed network idealism. And those 3 things are, of course, Snowden, when the revelations came out, Cambridge Analytica, a little bit more recently, and of course the TV series Black Mirror. Which when I started showing in class, it was all edgy and new. And now when I show clips, my students are like, yes, we've seen it, you know. So maybe that means it has become mainstream, and maybe that's a good thing. So, but if we think about this question of whether network idealism is dead, another way to put that question is to ask, if the network was the answer, what was the question? And if the network was the wrong answer, what kind of, the wrong question, what kind of wrong answers did we get? So more broadly, the way I ask those questions as well in my work is what kind of reality does the network produce? And how does the network reproduce capitalism? Now, I have attempted to provide some answers to those questions in my books, which, like I said, I will try to give you a little overview of what they're about. And the first book really had to do with exclusion and what kind of identities were generated when we are excluded from the network. How could exclusion help us resist and disidentify from the network? The second book is more about what the costs of unavoidable inclusion are. But let me just talk a little bit about the first book of the network. And there are a couple of concepts that I came up with that I think can help us theorize a critique of network idealism. The first concept is what I called nodocentrism. Now, if you think about a regular network image, The distance between any 2 points in the network, as you know, is finite. It can be breached. Maybe not directly, maybe through friends of friends. That's kind of degrees of separation. But the distance between a node and something that is outside of the network is, for all practical purposes, infinite. Yes? If something is not a node, it cannot be rendered in the network. Just a very brief example. Let's say I'm here in Berlin. I want to find good Pakistani restaurants, as my adopted nephew has promised to take me to one. And so, because I don't know the city, I check Google Maps. And if a restaurant is indexed by the system, I will be able to find it. If it's not, then it might as well not exist. Even if it's just 2 blocks away, I will not know about it. So that's sort of what I mean by nodocentrism. Nodocentrism, in other words, is a form of epistemological exclusivity that discriminates against that which is not part of the network. And basically, it motivates us to bring what is outside the network inside. Yes, all restaurants should be indexed by Google Maps so that people can find them. And this, of course, entails a whole politics of inclusion and exclusion. Now, to introduce the second concept, I want you to keep thinking about this image of the network. And usually, we see networks represented in this kind of way with lots of dots connected by lines. Now, I want you to basically shift your attention away from the nodes to the space between them. And in network diagrams, that space around the nodes is rendered in perfect emptiness, in stillness, in silence. But this space is far from barren. So if we shift our focus, we start to pay attention to what is happening in those empty spaces. And that is the second concept that I introduce of the network, and that is the concept of paranodality. So with this concept, basically, I mean that the outside of the network is not empty. Those spaces in between nodes are not empty. They are inhabited by what does not conform to the organizing logic of the network. Yeah, what doesn't fit, what can't be rendered. That is the paranodal. The paranodal might be, to use Rancier's terminology, the part of those who have no part. Yes, but that doesn't mean the paranodal is passive or subordinate. It can play a big role in actually shaping the network. Why is this space so important? Well, because these peripheries of the network represent the only sites from which to unthink or disidentify from the network. If we think about social progress, we've always had these spaces where it's very important to experiment, to think outside the box. And so this notion of paranodality, the spaces that surround the nodes, is very important to imagine deviations from the prevailing norms of network logic. All right, that's a brief summary of the first book. The second book, which just came out, is called The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. That's my co-author, Professor Nick Caudry from the London School of Economics. I do believe some copies were ordered, so I'm not exactly sure where they're available for sale somewhere in the vicinity. But what has happened between the first book and this one is that I think in 2013, when the first book came out, we could still comfortably occupy these paranodal peripheries, these outside spaces. And I'm concerned that we can't do that much anymore. It's becoming harder. So because of contemporary practices of data extraction, they have made inclusion even more problematic. So inclusion in networks comes at a cost. That's why it's called the cost of connection. So the exploitation that we are seeing represents not just a new form of capitalism, and we've all heard plenty of proposals, digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, etc. What we're arguing here is that it replicates colonial modes of extraction. So we're not just talking about capitalism, we're now talking about colonialism. And when we do that, of course, an initial question many people ask us is, how can you do that? Where is the violence? Yes, we all think of colonialism, historical colonialism, as an incredibly violent time. Yes, of course it was. So does this mean that we have an equal level of violence that matches the mayhem of historical colonialism? We're not saying that. We're not making a one-to-one comparison. But we are saying that there are continuities that should alarm us. Now, so in the book, we come up with this term of data colonialism. And let me just give you the definition. We say data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. And here, we're not basically meaning colonialism in a metaphorical way. We are saying that this is an emergent reality. So yes, we might not be seeing the same level of physical violence. There might be different kinds of violences happening. But the impact of the social change is, we argue, comparable. So in other words, there are differences between historical colonialism and data colonialism. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales, the contexts. But there is one important similarity: the function. The function is the same, and that function is to dispossess. So those are the continuities we're trying to trace between historical colonialism and data colonialism. So we are in fact talking about a new phase in the relations between colonialism and capitalism. And here, you know, when I discuss this with my students, I think we are accustomed to think about colonialism and capitalism as distinct and separate eras. So that colonialism happened, yes, it was awful, then it ended, and then along came capitalism, benign capitalism. Maybe also some defects, but certainly not as bad as colonialism. And I try to remind my students that actually there was a lot of overlap, and colonialism and capitalism coexisted for a very long time. And in fact, the wealth generated by colonialism financed the beginnings of industrial capitalism. Yes, so that some families even had factories in the centers of the empire and plantations in the colonies. Factories and plantations coexisted, and the function of one was to generate the wealth necessary for the creation of the other. Similarly, we argue today that this new form of colonialism is preparing the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, a new social order. And so the question is, how will we understand it? Well, one way to try to understand it is through Marx. There are other ways, but in the book we do consider Marx's contribution. And of course he provided one of the most important analyses of capitalism, but we also need to reinterpret some of his ideas, yes? So of course, for Marx, capitalism was made possible through labor relations. And we're saying that today that's not so much the case. So this emerging social order cannot be understood primarily through labor relations. Instead, we need to understand it through what we call data relations. Ways of reproducing life, social life, and configure social interactions to optimize this kind of data extraction for profit. So we need to extend the model, because what we do when we use social media is not work in the way that Marx meant it. It's not labor in the ways that Marx meant it. You know, it's social interaction. So we need to get a little bit creative. And here we borrow a page from the theorist Moshe Postone, which basically argued that capitalism is not just about labor. It's about taking things, I'm simplifying, of course. It's taking things outside of the economy and through abstraction make them part of a capitalist economy. Yes, this happens with labor, but it happens with lots of other things. So his point is that abstraction is the fundamental characteristic of capitalism. And data is, of course, abstracting life. So ordinary social life becomes a direct factor of capitalist production. Yes? So that human life is in fact annexed to capitalism through this continuous monitoring and influence on our decision making. So in the book, we basically conduct various transhistorical analyses to compare these two modes of production. And so we try basically to use the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. Coloniality, basically, it's a term by sociologist Aníbal Quijano, which means, yes, even if we think colonialism is dead, coloniality means the legacy of colonialism is still very much with us. Yes? So we organize these analyses of the coloniality of the relations in terms of the strategies used in strategy video games, like the one that we're showing here, which is actually the Colonialism series in the Civilization games. But in strategy video games, you do 4 things to succeed. You do these things over and over again, which you might be familiar with. You explore, you expand, you exploit, and you exterminate. Strategies of colonialism, right? So I don't have time to go into all of them, but I'll give you a quick example when we talk about exploration. So here, I want to compare 2 historical documents. The first one is the terms of use that you accept, that we all accept when we install Google Chrome. And I'm sure you have seen similar terms of use, or maybe you haven't seen them because we all just scroll through them and then click accept. But here's a little snippet. When you install Chrome, it says, give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. So when we install Google Chrome, we're starting this spiral of data extraction. Yes? I want to compare that to another document from colonialism. And this document was called the Requerimiento. It was a document read by Spanish conquistadors when they arrived to villages and cities in the New World. Many times they would arrive in the middle of the night. They would stand outside the village and they would proceed to read this document in Spanish to an audience that didn't speak Spanish. The document, I know it's kind of small, so I will read it, said, part of it, if you do not submit to our rule, I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods, and we shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. The Requerimiento 1513, accept and install. Yes. So we're not saying that what happened after the Requerimiento was read is exactly the same thing that happens after you install Google Chrome. That would be ridiculous. But we are trying to call attention in this specific case to the use of misleading language. Yes, to language that you are sure the audience will not understand, and at the same time set it up so that extraction can begin in a way that is justified to you. So data colonialism is so effective because it frames data by using new rationalities that are actually not very new. So I just want to quickly talk about some of these. These are economic, legal, technological rationalities that have a deep colonial past. And so let's start with cheap nature. To colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap, abundant, free. without owner. Yes, very crucial. At least a civilized owner. Nature was a mere residue or exhaust that needed technology to be processed, to be turned into something valuable, like refineries and so on and so forth, to be processed from its raw state to something that could, be sold. It could generate wealth. From cheap nature, we can move to cheap labor. Yes, it is the fate under a colonial system of some people, and this was largely determined by race, also by gender and by class, to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So this was exploitative, yes, but it was also presented as something that was for your own good. From cheap nature to cheap labor, we now move to cheap data, which shares some of the characteristics, yes, of these two things. It is abundant, without an owner, at least in its aggregate form. It doesn't belong to anybody. And likewise, it needs some sort of processing. Yes, that's why big technological companies have the technological know-how to process it, because we don't. Our job is simply to generate it, and then they transform it. And if we think that is exploitative, at the end of the day, we're told that it is for our own good. So in the book, we sort of trace this transition from cheap nature to cheap labor to cheap data. So if our job is only to generate cheap data, I would argue that we are not just digital natives, but digital native informants. And here I want to remind you of, for instance, one definition by Spivak in 1999, who basically said a native informant is a figure who in ethnography can only provide data to be interpreted by the knowing subject for reading. So there's this colonized subject, right, whose job is basically to generate this data that can be read by somebody else. We are informants because we are informing data on ourselves. So the colony is our social life, the metropolis is basically the network, And I see this as a form of betrayal of ourselves, yes, some sort of what happened in colonialism, the exchange of gold for trinkets, our social life exchanged for a filter that puts funny dog faces on your face. To contrast that, we have what I called the paranoid anti-colonialist. And basically, it is our job as such to reclaim colonized space and time. The space of surveillance, the space that has been colonized by all of these structures, the time that has been colonized, the time that we spend in front of screens. And as paranoid anti-colonialists, we have to reject this universal rationality of data collection and extraction. So, and what I say basically also is that we have to learn from past and present decolonization struggles. So, which doesn't mean that we have to play native and equate our position with the position of people who have been colonized for centuries. But I think it is important that we can learn some valuable lessons as far as those struggles. And since this is a festival about art and culture, I will end by suggesting that the role of culture is indeed very important. We need that to reimagine forms of collectivity. We need that to reimagine forms of technological appropriation, to ask the question of whether the master's tools can liberate the slave, and to rethink notions of common knowledge and solidarity. And we should also remember that during colonialism, when it was difficult to resist, many people, even if they couldn't resist with their bodies, they always had their minds to resist with. And that's why art and culture is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulises. We will continue now with the talk of Mel Hogan, who is the director of the Environmental Media Lab and also an assistant professor of communication, media and film at the University of Calgary. Mel has worked thoroughly on the social implications and environmental impacts of server farms and data servers. She's the founding co-member of the CIH Environmental Humanities Working Group at the University of Calgary on genomics and bioinformatics. On Wednesday, we heard Mel presenting her recent work on this topic in the framework of the transmediale McLuhan lecture at the Canadian Embassy. And today, we have the pleasure of having her with us to talk about what she describes as big data ecologies. Please welcome Mel Hogan. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the festival organizers for inviting me to speak. It's quite an honor. It's quite a beautiful venue. So for about 10 years now, I've been writing and thinking about data centers and cloud imaginaries. And when I was invited to participate in this discussion here today, I struggled to figure out, at this point, what do we more or less know or don't know? And what exactly do we care about when we think of empires and ecologies of the cloud? So over the holidays, I was watching the news with my mother, and there was a short filler story about how young people were becoming concerned about their digital footprints, becoming more aware of electronic waste. And the news reporters revealed that the data centers were the somewhat secret undergirding infrastructure for all of this. And of course, for many of us here today, I think this is likely not news per se, but it did surprise me to see this story on mainstream Canadian television. And I think it made my mother proud, that my scholarly interests are finally getting some airtime. And perhaps for you too, wherever it is you call home, similar moves are being made to showcase, if not reveal or expose, the materiality of the internet in conversation with climate change, climate activism, and the question of corporate versus individual responsibility. All of this to say, 10 years ago, just talking about warehouses that stored data was pretty mind-blowing. Today, I think this is less the case. We have a sense now, collectively, that the digital isn't entirely weightless, and we have a sense that it takes a lot to run and maintain the internet. A lot of land, a lot of cables, a lot of water, a lot of labor, a lot of power. In the print version of this TV news story that came out in early January, so shortly after the TV version, they concluded that, and there's a quote here, it's a little bit too small, so I'll read it to you, but basically that computing will gobble up 11% of global energy by 2030, and cloud-based services will represent a sizable proportion of that, and that this will become completely unsustainable by 2040. But when we say something will become unsustainable, aren't we saying it already is? Shouldn't unsustainable always and only ever be a concept of the present, a reflection that we make about now, our current conditions and practices? In other words, while we may run out of power, land, water, rare earth minerals, and sacrifice zones in 20 years at growing rates of online consumption, it doesn't mean that we're good for 20 years, and it's misleading to even imagine that we're okay for right now. And I'll circle back to this idea a few times. I hope this is something we can discuss afterwards about the cloud, especially when we consider it to be a part of a big data ecology of sorts. So when I last visited a data center, the Bahnhofpionen in Stockholm, Sweden, in 2018 with Tung-Hui Hu and Asta Vandro, who's actually here with us today, the CEO of Bahnhof told us, as he was showing off a highly energy efficient server room, which is pictured on the right here, that a few Google searches use the same amount of energy as cooking an egg. And I've always liked these comparatives, and I use them often for research alongside official measurements because they help us to better relate our day-to-day activities to the internet's energy consumption, and they're also more useful for conveying the extent to which the digital is not immaterial and not necessarily ephemeral, even as images and texts and emails get deleted from our devices or disappear from our screens. They remain on servers. Nothing we generate really gets removed from this equation. It often just gets stored deeper. So apparently we only about 6% of all the data we've ever created is in active use today, 6%. So when I first started my work on data centers in around 2011, showing an image like this of data centers, especially in the context of teaching, and telling people or students that our data was stored inside actual buildings was really exciting and was really revealing. But now, given the investments made by big tech itself to appear both environmentally friendly and politically transparent, we've been treated with slick corporate representations of infrastructure. The two most common, I think, are Google's colorful pipes and Facebook's equally branded blueness. And I'd invite you all to read the work of Jennifer Holt and Patrick Vondrow, Where the Internet Lives, for more on these kind of depictions. So one thing I won't say too much about today, or too much conclusively, but that I'm currently thinking and writing about, I haven't come to any big insights, but I think is good for discussion, are the ways that new data centers are being planned and designed. The largest one yet, as far as I know, was slated to open in 2018 in Belangen, Norway. So last summer, my brother and I drove up to this proposed site. I wanted to see with my own eyes what the landscape looks like compared to the plans rendered by architects. What's amazing about this design is that it was recommending a new data center the size of about 89 football fields to look like a field of glaciers. So it was to be built over an old town dump, apparently, and this would be a welcome view for those living in the area or passing by on the E6, which was, you can see in the sort of screen grab there, is the main road that requires you to look down that way. And it's currently a field of, it's actually quite beautiful, of pink and purple flowers, and there's an airstrip that you can see on the left there as well for small planes. These plans fell through, and the data center is not going to be built. But I think it provides a lot for thinking through the relationship between data center imaginaries and the changing landscapes on which they're being built or not. As Allison Carruth has noted in her writing on the digital cloud and the micropolitics of energy, data infrastructure is often described by way of ecological metaphors, right? So we have cloud computing, we have server farms, we have mountains of data, we have streaming content. Similarly, as Stephen Levy writes of these things in biological terms. He speaks of the blinking blue lights of servers as its nervous system, and the endless racks of servers as the throbbing heart of the internet. A connection to the body in this way might soften the critique, or at the very least make us imagine a relationship between how the internet is powered and our own bodies. So in writing about the bicycle-powered internet in 2012, corporate anthropologist Jane Ann Morris manages to do just this. She calculated, for example, that a well-trained cyclist can produce a constant 100 watts per hour on a bicycle generator, and that 4 generator bikes at 100 watts per hour apiece can power 1 server. But that 1 server can't accomplish much if we consider that something like a Google search activates between 1,000 and 20,000 servers all over the world, and that Google data center processes upward of 40 million searches per second. So again, based on Morris's estimates, to power a medium-sized data center, which, I mean, these things are hard to estimate, but would hold roughly 50,000 servers, which I think is about, half of what Google has dedicated for searches alone. If we were to power this by bicycle power, it would require almost 1 million pedalers in an area equivalent to approximately 350 football fields. And this is if we account for the energy usage in 2020. There just aren't enough cyclists on the entire planet to maintain the pedaling required to power our online habits. So my point here is not at all to make a link between individual activity or energy expenditures to the global environmental crisis, so much as to show that we've seriously outpaced ourselves collectively by any measure taken if the internet grows on much of the existing infrastructure and logics that we have now. So rather than rethink and restructure the cloud, we seem to be building more data centers in the image of climate change itself. And I think the Kolos example of the glaciers is somewhat evades this, or is a kind of utopic denial of this point. But I want to show a few concrete examples for discussion, each with their own complications. Together, though, this becomes evidence of the sort of perverse twist on sustainability we see in the industry's discourse to make our infrastructure withstand increasingly harsh and destructive planetary conditions instead of addressing the problem of neoliberal policies and colonial extractivist capitalism. So in the last few years, the severe drought and forest fires in California have been headlined, visualized, and widely extrapolated by the news media as a case study of the early ravages of climate change, especially in the global north. Meanwhile, California is also home to one of the largest cloud computing facilities in the US, with upward of 800 data centers, yet the electricity they consume and the tremendous water required by data centers to cool their servers is rarely discussed in relation to the harsh effects of climate change. Snippet number 2. As Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston with catastrophic flooding in October 2017, displacing its citizens and causing ongoing power outages for thousands of them, some data centers in the area remained operational. Diesel generators allowed the lights to stay on and kept the servers running. One data center in the area was stocked with food, water, cots, showers, and even washing machines. It provided a safe harbor for its workers, but also their family members, and even some of the United States Marshal. This data center was specifically built to withstand a hurricane, a tornado, or an ice storm to keep the internet services going. And because it's located in Texas, it was, of course, built to safeguard the data of practically every single large oil and gas company in the world. So we might see some of the incentive there. All right, snippet number 3. Google is now the largest corporate renewable energy buyer on the planet. In 2012, Google headlined on its own company blog that it was helping the Chattahoochee River, what they call the Hooch, with water conservation at their Douglas County, Georgia data center. So having partnered with the County Water and Sewer Authority in 2007, Google was able to rely on recycled water from the Hooch to cool servers for its data centers. The water is treated, filtered, sterilized, and chlorinated once more at the Google-built side stream, the effluent treatment plant, before it circulates through its evaporative cooling towers, and before 70% of it is returned to the river, with 30% diverted back to the data center. And this has meant an increased capacity to save water in reservoirs for times of drought. This was Google's first water treatment plant in the US and was constructed based on similar plans in Belgium, where it treats water from an industrial canal. In Belgium, Google built a 20,000 square foot water treatment plant, which removes solid materials and sludge, which is in turn repurposed for cement manufacturing and landfill. Overall, Google data center engineers working towards greening their quote-unquote smart water technology assert that there's no impact on the availability of water in any given region if every drop is, and this is in their own words, returned to its origins. So again, in a promotional context, no further insight emerges about what delimits impact or how such a thing might be measured. Since 2010, the nonprofit organization called Carbon Disclosure Project has been pressuring companies to issue reports on their water consumption, but this request has been largely denied. The comments on Google's promotional smart water video are divided and reflect some of the general public's views, concerns, and questions. Some praise Google's efforts towards sustainability, and others question its propagandistic tone. While the praise echoes the words of Google itself to frame the environment as something to manage responsibly by working to restore and replenish what it uses, the skepticism points to more common and larger questions about multinational corporations becoming increasingly entangled with public infrastructure. As big tech is successfully making itself self-sustaining through renewable energies, these companies increasingly exist as islands and fortresses of data, where communities are effectively pushed out and can only exist outside of this media ecosystem. In times of severe droughts or floods, it's unclear who will be given priority, communities or big tech, and we don't know how this priority will be measured. Or maybe we do. In Houston, the data center stayed on while tens of thousands of individuals went without power. So in terms of big data ecologies, Google puts to work each displaced and repurposed material byproduct by way of data center infrastructure. Oil and gas data centers become shelters from the storm. The industry at large protects itself against the condition it co-creates and co-constitutes. So one final snippet for consideration. There are plans to lay internet cables in the Northwest Passage, linking Japan and the UK by way of the Arctic seafloor. This undersea and terrestrial cable passage also entails locating landing sites and data centers in their proximity. Global warming is melting the Arctic ice, opening up the waters to myriad industries. In this case, big tech plays a role in shaping the landscape. Plans to lay internet cables in the Northwest Passage began to appear publicly online in 2012, generated by the Toronto-based company at the time, Arctic Fiber. And in May 2016, Arctic Fiber was bought by an Anchorage-based company called Quintillion, and the plans seem to have been only partially materialized as of today. In industry terms, these Arctic cables are particularly notable for their potential to increase connectivity in terms of at least the perceptions of speed and to reduce costs. These cables would transmit data from Tokyo to London in just 154 milliseconds, making it the most efficient connection to date between Japan and the UK. This phenomenon is inviting new imaginaries of the North, but foremost and still, it's a shortcut for the large wired cities on either end and not really for anything along the way. What this new quest also illustrates is that colonial imaginaries of the North persist, long since the many failed attempts by explorers in the early 1600s and on to make the passage by boat. The melting Arctic ice is accelerating the speed at which new corporate visions for the North are informing emergent dominant discourses, that as long as the environmental concerns are addressed alongside corporate interests, then it can be business as usual. Much of data center infrastructure depends on climate and temperature for their installation, maintenance, and day-to-day operations. These same factors, namely geography, temperature, and climate, also function to rank locations according to a global data center risk index, alongside other factors such as the cost of energy, international bandwidth, tax incentives, and political stability, also all factors influenced and changed by global warming. Arguably then, only as long as the data center industry understands itself as outside of the environment are these logics able to frame and measure risk in this way. However, by making the link between tax breaks, deregulation, and climate change, the issue becomes rather how to measure the risk of data centers onto the environment. So by flipping the equation around to measure the impact of data centers on the environment rather than the locational viability of data centers based on environmental instability, we can begin to ask different questions about the formations of infrastructural space as complex media ecologies. The growing tension between global warming and this quest for cold storage by big tech shows how data centers are foremost infrastructural imaginaries in constant negotiations with their environment, searching out a stability that is never neutral, always constructed. Even as a fabrication, it's an unsustainable one, of which the Arctic simply represents one last hope. As Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg put it in 2017, Withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement is bad for the environment, bad for the economy. We've committed that every new data center we build will be powered by 100% renewable energy. Stopping climate change is something we can only do as a global community, and we have to act together before it's too late. Similarly, also in 2017, Joe Cava, Google Vice President of Data Centers, claimed that huge cloud operators have a responsibility to use their buying power to drive changes in the US utility industry, which should boost its mix of renewables and make clean energy available to its customers. So, Facebook, Google, and Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, what we call altogether the Big Five, have all made similar promises and have indicated that this helps them meet their corporate social responsibility goals. So on the surface, it looks like big tech is taking on the task of making global energy more sustainable for the environment's sake, to fight climate change, but big tech unwittingly follows its own uneasy logic, one that situates the environment, technology, and humans within an a priori system-based framework that is self-regulating and self-organizing. Arguably, neoliberalism is the dominant ecological ideal of our era. That is the idea that managed nature maintains an equilibrium that can be restored if disrupted through both calculable and mappable market-driven assessments and interventions. So to finish up on this idea of ecology, ecosystems, and systems ecology. Ecology, and I'd like actually to think through maybe the first exchange this morning. I'm giving a little bit of a linear sort of account of ecology, but this is just sort of a shorthand for that. I also don't sort of believe in these, linear historical retellings. Ecology is the broadest but youngest of sciences. It was first conceived during the 18th century as an economy of nature by Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus, who observed and documented the interactions of plants and animals. In 1866, ecology got its official name from a German biologist, Ernst Haeckel, and the concept shifted from lab to field. Early ecology produced food chain diagrams and animal pyramids as a means to interpret and explain the various support systems at play in specific contexts. In the 1920s and 1930s, ecological work became quantified and partitioned in order to be explored scientifically, where principles of physical chemistry could be applied to nature. However, the ideas that ended up most transforming the field were the recognition of organisms as part of a physical environment and the observation of competition among species. Modern ecology emerged in the 1970s, developed as a utilitarian and service-based approach to generate public interest in environmental conservation. Through these reconfigurations, the field shifted again from ecology to ecosystems to systems ecology. By the 1990s, ecosystems management became more overtly a method to estimate the economic value of natural resources, so nature as commodity. As we see with big tech, land and water in particular have become incorporated into trade mechanisms. Incorporated into trade mechanisms. An expanded and more readily interdisciplinary adaptation of the concept of big data ecologies can be employed to advance our understanding of big tech as convenience of the global north, where waste and polluting processes are most often done in an unacknowledged elsewhere, as a system that relies heavily on disjunctures and contradictions, usually for greenwashing purposes, and on public perception of communications infrastructure as cloud-like and, again, ephemeral, immaterial. While more environmentally sound in the immediate sense, green alternatives situated in proximity to sites of consumption, but not production, ultimately cannot inherently resolve questions of social accountability or enlightened governance that are crucial in terms of current policy debates. Indeed, it's extremely problematic to ask these companies to take on a central role in the debate of what constitutes the public good when they have other very real objectives, such as providing returns to their stockholders. So part of the problem here, a big part, is the erosion of regional, national, and international public policy that could set and attain good energy goals through legislation, rather than leave it to the good graces of a company which is subject to the fickle winds of public perception. So instead of dealing with consumption at the site of production, big tech is investing in large swaths of land, public infrastructure, and in the management and containment of natural resources, primarily in its marketplace as discursively enclosed ecosystems. So just as Houston's sprawling housing and industrial developments on vulnerable waterways could not stand in the way of the so-called 100-year storm, Hurricane Harvey, big tech is building containment systems that will not achieve the same goals in data management. It does this in order to counter competition for the growing rarity of natural resources, to control its sources of energy, and to keep up with the ever-growing consumption demands for data. It's grabbing at natural resources, water and land, and also at wind and sun, to seem self-sufficient and also, by way of complex definitions, self-contained. This pairing is not necessarily new nor specific to new media economies. However, these examples demonstrate the ways in which big tech becomes a spawning species of its own, at once fungal, feral, and invasive. The concept of the ecosystem, created long ago through dubious methods, has been updated and rearticulated, but not fundamentally rethought. It has managed to remain in the public imaginary as the most important way to conceive of the relationship between humans and nature, while the idea of human impact on nature propelled by neoliberal policies is now indisputable. The concept of ecology and of managing ecosystems risks provides false hope. What we need to come to terms with as a culture is that there is no state of equilibrium to return to. That is a worldview rendered obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. I would like to invite our speakers and respondents to join me on stage for the conversation. I will not preempt the conversation by already starting with comments and questions of mine. Instead, I will invite our three guests to provide their responses. So I will briefly introduce them to you. First, we will hear from Solveig Suess, who works in the fields of documentary design and writing. Her practice engages with how circuits of trade, information, and climates are inextricably tied to the politics of capital, power, and control. Solveig was a Digital Earth Fellow after graduating from Strelka and the Center for Research Architecture also at Goldsmiths, London. She's also the co-author of Geocinema, which was also presented at Transmediale last year. And this year at the festival, she presents her documentary essay, A Cargo, which is hosted in the exhibition program of Transmediale. And I believe we will get a chance to get a taste of it. Then, right after Solveig, we will hear from Teresa Dillon, who is an artist and a researcher. And her work focuses on urban spaces and the situated lived entanglements of techno-civic systems. Recent works relevant to what we will be discussing include the project In Your Aerial on the care, inheritance, and heritage of a community in the internet network, and the project AMHR, a sculptural installation on the effect of surveillance infrastructures. I should mention that since 2013, Teresa hosts Urban Nights, a public program that discusses alternatives to city living. And 2 years ago, she established Repair Acts, an international network and program aiming to reimagine what we define as growth. And last but not least, we will hear from Sarah Friend, who is an artist and software engineer with special interest in blockchain and the peer-to-peer web. Sarah has exhibited in numerous places her work. She's, as it says, a proud Recurse Center alum, a self-directed, community-driven educational retreat in New York City. And very interestingly for our discussion, she's also one of the organizers of the conference Our Networks, which took place last fall in Toronto. So we will start with Solveig.
Hi. So first I wanted to say thank you to Daphne for the invitation and also to respond to these really brilliant and inspiring talks. And in a few minutes I'll just share a few excerpts of AAA Cargo, which is on loop in the HKV. And to briefly introduce the context of this film, the summer of 2017 I joined my two uncles on a road trip from Urumqi, Xinjiang to Beijing. And just to note the scale of Xinjiang, the most western province of China, the province is larger than Spain, France, and Germany put together. And so the highway we were on always ran in parallel with two other lines, one which was still under construction, high-speed rail, and another which was the Chongqing-Xinjiang-Europe rail route, which later formed as part of the overland infrastructure project of the Belt and Road Initiative. The rail route was initiated by the international tech conglomerate Hewlett-Packard, who had made an agreement with the Chinese state to initiate the construction of this rail line in 2012. Their agreement was, quote, defined not only according to business logic, but also with certain strategic calculation, end quote. Faster than slow ocean, cheaper than air freight, this rail route from Chongqing cuts through Xinjiang province into Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and Poland before reaching its destination in Germany 11,180 kilometers later. Here, efficiency had been implemented through different scales within stratas of inventory lists to political economic agreements along the railway. Thousands of laptop computers and accessories are piled neatly in these sealed shipping containers to travel across 3 times a week. The train route displaces the border, where security checks are closer to Belarus, with Hewlett-Packard implementing their own border customs software. A 2-day wait has been eliminated because of the Eurasian Customs Union Agreement. This project is designed to stave off slowing economies by recasting geographies through the rearranging of the inside and outside of state space. Actions like military occupation, land grabs, and dispossessions are all part of its territorial reconfiguration.
下午3点，我们又上路了。人们有时候说，一整个镇子就这样没了，只是为了缩短3个小时的旅程。沙子从每个方向以每年10米的速度向这里移动，有时候会达到20米。沙子给时间设定了循环模式，它从不停止，只是会休息。向外望去，我在想，这些景观是多么容易就和风串通一气了。新的铁路线也随之延绵，轨道沿线是网格交叉状的护坡，沙尘防护设施放缓了大地的移动。它的目的不仅是消除沙漠的存在，而也是在这一刻将沙子的未来定格。 沙子提醒我们，沙漠是从现在的边缘滋生出来的。在这里，时间被压缩，沉淀成堆积物，材料将未来的图景一层层叠加起来。有些事物加速出现，而有一些则是被放缓了脚步。
So this nervous root has become one of the most monitored areas in China, with its anti-political calculations, cost-benefit analysis, and market-driven logics embedded themselves in the most minute of measures. The neoliberal calculations for speed and the least amount of resistance exceeds into biopolitical modes of control of the local Uyghur population, alongside the management of increasingly strange weather and growing deserts across the province. Trace personas and ghost murmurings from risk assessments, weather monitoring, credit ratings, your next possible purchase, his favorite color, feedback into concrete, metal, security, and boundary-forming protocols, building a synchronization of histories which sediment into the discursive infrastructures we find ourselves in. An endless doubling effect, it hides the idea that the construction of right here is built of elsewheres. And I'll just play the last little segment.
金露露啊，快到没时间做梦。他感叹道，向苹果手机里蓝绿色的深渊投去一笔，手指灵动地按触在一旁回荡。亲爱的，您有新的货品到了。亲爱的，今日您将收到一份礼物：美白牙齿、脱毛、增发。新上市的电子产品，高质货品，保你好心情。加盟商业、KTV、舞蹈、教学、推广、生意、娱乐120个国际群，包月仅1490元。我们在一片虚无的疆土上慌忙穿行。脚下踩着的界面瞬息万变，地名无关紧要，历史纪念弥漫不清。新丝绸之路在别处铺就，留下的是一串串待完成的商寮，一块块合成的废墟和满眼像素般的沙石。
Thank you very much. Teresa, would you like to offer your comments?
Thank you. So I guess in the spirit of this response, in a way, I'm sort of drawn by this colonial narrative and this term, or one of the sentences that I'm going to extract from your talk, actually. We should do all the mischief and damage we can. I think we should maybe try to say that out loud together. Okay, so I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and maybe we can try to say this together. 1, 2, 3. We shall do all the mischief and damage we can. Right, I think that's probably where we might need to be at the moment in this urgent climatic times, in a way. Thank you to all of the speakers and to Daphne and Christoph and everyone at Transmediale for inviting us here today. It's an interesting role that we have to play in this particular sort of sense, but I was sort of trying to think when I heard the two talks how my own work kind of connects to it at the moment, and where the two can maybe meet in a way. And I recently wrote a paper called Liquid Loss, Learning How to Grieve the Loss of Companion Species and Landscapes, for the Journal of Screen City Journal. And within this, I was addressing how this notion of a grief that we may be experiencing, but we cannot really tangibly feel in the same way that you might feel the grief of the loss of one close to you, for example, but is still at the same time registered, particularly in the context of mass species loss at the moment. And Mel had related this kind of point, I think, to the body, that in a way this return to the body seemed to be something that I thought was perhaps quite an important thing to bring into the kind of the discussion here today. And then you referred to how can we soften this kind of issue around the environmental impact of the consumption, essentially, of our data use. So I would just like to kind of put that out there in terms of a return to the body. And then that also made me think, Ulises, of your work in relation to this question of data dispossession, and how do we actually make tangible that data dispossession, in a sense, that is actually happening. And I guess that's where I sort of see this sort of connect between this paper also on what I refer to as liquid loss, in a sense, this liquidity of these processes that are not necessarily physically kind of felt in a conscious kind of capacity, but are registered in a more sensorial kind of way. So I guess that's kind of one of the points of response that I kind of wanted to kind of flag out. And I guess in this call to do mischief and damage, I think that it's, in terms of strategies and tactics for where we might be at this particular moment in time, the right or capitalism, whatever ways you might want to refer to these world orders that were present within, they have been very good at adopting our, leftist, nerdy, weirdy, wilbily, wonderfully kind of ways of awkwardness within the world. And perhaps it's not a bad kind of point to think about how we can adopt their strategies and massive claims of doing as much mischief and damage as we can in order for their agenda, I say their, we, us, intangible things that produce these things to kind of together. So that was the other sort of, I guess, kind of point really in a way. And one of the other third kind of point I wanted to throw out there in terms of a response was maybe kind of unpacking a little bit this notion of data colonialism and how that word itself, colonialism, locks us into particular narratives which have been discussed, and you eloquently pointed out what you're sort of taking and borrowing from that and looked at its historical function in the economic sort of sense. But when we do use those words, it also leads us into a narrative of extraction. And so I was thinking about what are the new imaginaries, the new legal and philosophical frameworks that we kind of need to move us away from that kind of uses of language. I'm thinking about Gibson and Graham's concepts of diverse economy, and the iceberg, with capitalism being at the visible front end, the bit that we see above sea level, but that there's many, many orderings and otherings and ways of living patterns that we organize that are not colonial, that are not capitalist, that are not extractive. And maybe that's, you know, sociologists would talk about them as the weak stories, but they're not weak, they're our everyday life. They're the things that keep us living, that keep us sustained, they're the life force that keeps things moving, and maybe that's what my call out as well is, in terms of a response, is to how can we, perhaps as scholars, academics, and artists, maybe step away from reproducing these redundant terms in our discourses that might actually just be not helping to reimagine what a more equitable, just life might be.
Thank you, Teresa. And Sarah, would like to say a few words?
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you, all of my fellow presenters. I don't have an incantation to begin with. That was wonderful. So I'll just speak a little bit about the way that I've approached the subjects of this panel in my own work. Like Daphne said, I'm an artist and software engineer. It's sort of a dual practice. And I'm also one of the co-organizers of a conference in Toronto called R Networks, about all aspects of the peer-to-peer and alternative web. So that's looking at new protocols, peer-to-peer and offline first computing, and community-based governance. So sort of trying to hear from projects at all layers of the stack, from mesh networks up to sort of the softer human layer of workers' solidarity or co-op administrators. And really kind of capturing the diversity of peer-to-peer protocols that are being actively built. So maybe to take up the question that you asked at the beginning of your presentation of if networks are the answer, what is the question? From the R Networks perspective, it's really to follow up with another question, which is which network? And maybe in my own work, I've done sort of artistic projects that explore the affordances of peer-to-peer in relationship to the climate crisis. Most recently, a project that seems to have a lot of synergy with the paper Teresa spoke about, called Remembering Network, which is a memorial to extinct, endangered, and threatened animals, which takes the form of a crowdsourced archive of images and notes written to these animals, which is hosted on peer-to-peer platforms. And I guess this project made me think of what Mel said, of how these data centers of the traditional sort of client-server internet are built in the image of climate crisis in some ways. Peer-to-peer protocols are also kind of built in the image of climate crisis. And these sort of remote Arctic data centers literally imitating glaciers. It's incredibly perverted. But Remembering Network is maybe riffing similarly off of the Svalbard Seed Vault, trying to be a version of a seed vault that can live in a community amongst all of us, built and maintained together. And I guess something I'm interested in as well as a builder of alternative networks is in response to maybe like, is network idealism dead? I certainly hope so as well. And it's to be within those communities, opening conversations about the ways that the things that we're building, the alternative imaginaries that we're constructing, are themselves not utopian and don't solve every problem. So, for example, a way that comes up is in the case of open source. A lot of the protocols rely on free software, open source libraries, which are maintained by people who work for free. And that labor is both extracted by the big tech corporations that we're critical of on this panel, but simultaneously, on a flip side, weirdly subsidized by them, because the privilege of open source maintainers to work for free is in some ways afforded by the otherwise high-paying tech salaries. Or maybe peer-to-peer protocols which address data sovereignty, or maybe provide or suggest alternative visions for how we might own our data. But in the case of energy efficiency, don't offer any real improvements. I have more points, but I'll end there. I feel like there's much to be discussed.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Taking in mind also what our three respondents now kind of also brought in, I was wondering if we should start by the old but always important topic of resistance in a way, which also kind of links, of course, to the main question that was behind this panel about how basically to oppose and how to decolonize, let's say, the empires of the cloud. I wanted to return to some things that also were recently now mentioned. So, for instance, in your talk, Mel, you said that there is no equilibrium to return to. I have noted here from Ulises' book, at some point you mentioned that there is no behind in the age of data colonialism, where you kind of commenting a bit on the thought of hard and negri, like some older writing. And now also kind of Teresa brought in the topic of strategies, but also, like, importantly, this notion of grieving. And we heard a bit also about the need of strategies. So I was wondering if we could pick it up from there, and if we maybe discuss a bit how can we address, again, this topic of resistance in the case of what Ulises brought in. We can also kind of return to what you had mentioned in your previous book. Is it still, for instance, possible to disidentify, as you had then written, and which maybe practices or which knowledges we can kind of bring in? Maybe you, Ulises or Mel, who would like to start?
First. She's going to go first.
It's actually quite difficult to answer on the spot when we're thinking of, solutions to climate change in relation to, one of the, I'd say, largest socio-technical imaginaries of our time. But I guess if it's left up to me in this moment, I would say that we're a little bit stuck in the logics. I don't know if that came through in this paper, but we keep sort of finding solutions, but within a particular set of very sort of confined things that we assume cannot change. So I think if the internet is a given, then we're searching for solutions that are, in a sense, to green, the infrastructures that then provide that service. And I wonder if we need to rethink, if we need to, probably at this point we can't abolish the internet, but I wonder if we could, if there's other ways to start at the level of imaginaries to kind of rethink the things that we think need to be sort of rendered or made into data. So I think we've created a sort of a beast, and now to say, well, how do we solve this problem that we created to solve problems? I think that's what's so interesting, is all of this data was supposed to solve problems, and then we had to create these warehouses to store that data that any minute now, if we just get enough data, we'll solve those problems, right? So I feel like I'm absolutely not answering the question, just creating more of this sense of impossibility around this, but if anyone wants to save me, please jump in.
Well, I don't know if this one still works. I think so. Yes, just very briefly, Nick and I are often accused of being too pessimistic in presenting the work, and maybe speaking for myself, the fact that I'm from the global south, maybe I have a higher tolerance for pessimism and familiarity with fatalism, which I don't necessarily see as a bad thing. But I do think part of the attempt in trying to frame this in terms of colonialism is to suggest the magnitude of the problem, because colonialism was not something that anyone won, or it wasn't a single war, of course. But, I mean, even if we just consider the continued legacy of colonialism, we're talking about massive changes in social orders. And with data colonialism, it's concerning that in just a few decades, we've been able to mount this social order that is equally momentous. And so resisting it, unpacking it, dismantling it, can it even be possible? Can it be done? I don't know. I think we have 3 good examples in our respondents here of different modes of resistance. But we do talk in the book about the limits of boutique kinds of resistance. And so obviously quitting Facebook is not going to do it, right? And passing certain kinds of legislations might ameliorate the problem a little bit, but it's also not going to end data colonialism. So it's true, I think you said that, yes, the war locks us into certain narratives. And that's partly intentional, just in the sense that we need to appreciate the magnitude of the new social order.
Maybe I'll say that there are many activist strategies, and I think that all offer their own possibilities. But for me, at least, in terms of the Remembering Network project and the sort of question of how do we solve climate change, what was actually the important realization or acceptance, and I'm so sorry, everyone, that I'm going to say this, is that we actually aren't going to solve climate change. And realizing that and reading more about the problem and realizing the scale of what confronts us is what began the grieving process that led to the work. And I think that one of the things I thought was that the grief and the acceptance of that was actually like an important stage towards the building of alternatives, towards the beginning to escape that trap. So, yeah, I feel like you've also written about this.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, an important part to accept somehow the death or an inevitable death in a way. And if, you know, I guess without going into sort of full details of the history of, in some way, psychological responses to how we deal with grief, there's all of these different stages depending on the model. There's 5, there's 6, there's 7, depending on the theorist that you kind of you know, follow. But I guess the point I was trying to make in the paper is that in sort of accepting that there is a potential felt bodily perception of a grief from the loss of a landscape, from the loss of a species that's not in your habitat or local to you, you potentially start to think about ways to work through that and avoid pathologizing, it's a bit of an awkward word, that grief, which can then, you know, end up into a more sort of serious mental health kind of conditions. So when we talk about, I guess, strategies towards data colonialism in a way, and the dispossession that you're kind of speaking about, it just reminded me of thinking about like what are stages, in a sense, what are psychological stages that could fortify the self, the mind, the soul, that actually enables you to perhaps deal with that narrative as well, or deal with that reality in the way that dealing with the inevitability of climate change and where it's heading and the condition that we're in at the moment, yeah, is kind of, I guess, the link that I'm sort of seeing between these things. And that also echoes, I think, into the landscapes that are both reflected in Mel's work and in the film as well.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, I think it's exactly after your presentation where I started to think a lot about how, again, it's like paying more attention to how, you know, these logistical technologies are being implemented even further so. And, you know, when I was looking more at Hewlett-Packard and how its history, especially with supply chain capitalism, came to being, how it was reproducing cheap labor and as well as cheap nature across long distances. I think it was interesting, especially looking at things like just-in-time management and managerial sciences, and how this kind of created this geography of concealment, as Rob Nixon would say. And again, I think you know, seeing how Hewlett-Packard is implicated in things like biometric control of like, even in Israel, like occupied territory of Palestine, as well as how it was also in South Africa. This kind of collusion and risk management of calculations of both like risk management of environments as well as biopolitical modes of control becomes very apt. And I think it's easy to like drown in not understanding how to really enter within these kind of narratives, but I think it's exactly in kind of decomposing, or at least like unpicking these narratives that then you find other entry points in, whether it's, you know, as designers, thinking about maybe workflows of other smaller institutions or other ways of organizing that might somehow address these conditions, right? So again, like not being overwhelmed by the hegemonic, but then finding smaller entry points in there, I think is increasingly important.
I feel like maybe just thinking about, you said in the last comment that you made, quitting Facebook won't do it. And I guess it's making me see a connection between Mel's presentation and Ulises' presentation as well, which is possibly why we're all in a panel together, but it's something I've been asking myself, as well as in the case of a multinational corporation like Facebook or Hewlett-Packard, like there is no regulatory body that can really address it. The problem is sort of too big. We make legislation by the country, maybe by the scale of the EU, but, you know, globally speaking. And I think there's like a parallel there in the case of climate change of like what is the regulatory body that actually has authority to enforce. So I just wanted to suggest that parallel and see if it felt resonant to anyone else.
I mean, I see the parallels. Yeah, no comment, but I'm going to let it sink in. You know, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a multidimensional problem, and we do need to consider not just the environmental aspect. I mean, I was actually thinking, responding to your comment about grief, and the work of Frantz Fanon often comes to mind when I'm writing about these things, and his psychopathology of the colonized subject, the idea that colonialism creates certain neuroses in the colonized subject. And, you know, tomorrow we're going to have Hert's presentation on Sad by Design, which I think is sort of like the new psychopathology of data colonialism, right? If we look at how it's generating the depression, the anxiety, the narcissism, we can start to put all of these things together. Of course, pressure, pessimism that comes with seeing climate change and not being able to do anything about it. I think all of those things feed into each other.
I think picking up on that, I mean, you know, if you push that to its extreme, it's also, you know, this extreme quantified self, in a way, which is an isolated self, in a sense. So I'm thinking also then of the work of Manuel Beltrain and his data workers union and data cooperatives and, you know, strategies like that as well, which can actually perhaps, you know, be tactics, approaches, methodologies that we need to start to kind of like think about in terms of data literacies. You know, do I produce only half of my amount of data, or do I turn, you know, it's not just about turning off your devices or getting off Facebook, as you say, but, you know, multiple ways of kind of like working in this more communal kind of capacity where you're also perhaps even also fudging your data or, you know, sending out streams of it, all of the kind of usual sort of tactics that have been kind of there before as covert mechanisms as well. You know, these are all kind of, you know, weapons of the weak, let's say, as Scott would say, in a sense. And I think that when we speak about data colonialism, then these tactics that were also used by cultures and communities to continue survival, you know, where the dance is actually the warrior's training, you know, is that where we're at?
I wonder if within the framework of discussing, let's say, strategies and the topic of resistance, we should return a bit to the two main notions, let's say, that you used in your talks respectively, so colonialism on one hand and ecology on the other, and how they, of course, connect to Western hegemonic policies. So this question to decolonize, of course, brings to the foreground how and who is going to do that. When we talk about this relation of capitalism with colonialism, this brings, for instance, up the topic of racial capitalism. So different aspects come up that we need to take in mind. Once we used to talk about the asymmetries in the networks, now the word is not even enough. It doesn't describe in a way what we are talking about. So I was wondering if there are any examples or if there are any kind of ideas from your side about how this reference, this linkage to the past can bring some kind of possible responses, because I feel that we kind of all agree that, like we agree on, let's say, on the critique, we agreed on the need to reimagine, but it feels a bit like we tend to get stuck there, not all of, only us in this stage. It's also something that I heard in the morning panel, like this need to kind of escape the critique. I don't know if you would like to comment on that, and then we should open up the floor to the stage. So if you have any questions, be ready.
I would just maybe say a quick thing. Yeah, first of all, the exchange this morning kind of blew my mind, just for rethinking how time works. But I think if we let infrastructure and data centers sort of aside for a minute, and we even talk about climate change, I think we have this idea, and I was thinking of this when I was watching that the news story with my mother, about how data centers were kind of like the secret reveal of like what's really at the heart of all of these problems. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because that affects a particular kind of, the sort of where it was located. It's like a particular location of something being disrupted or bothered. And I think in terms of climate change, we're kind of, it's always sort of, oh, it's about to happen. It's always this kind of future tense thing. And, that's why I like to sort of bring in colonialism, or at least sort of this white settler position within that question, because for some people, climate change has already happened, is happening, et cetera. So these different temporalities, I think, are really important for thinking through climate change. And I thought, oh, that was interesting. The data center is this kind of reveal, I thought, linked very much to like the problems of white people, or there was something that matched the infrastructure where suddenly we should start paying attention, and the we in that was like a more sort of normative we. So, yeah.
I don't have anything to add at the moment. Why don't we take questions?
Or maybe one of our other guests wants to comment on something before we take more questions.
I'll hold what I was going to say. We can take some questions.
Take questions? Okay. Are there any questions for our speakers from the audience? We don't see much, so please. There is one there, I see.
So thank you for the presentations. You really gave us a good picture of the scale of how horrendous our situation kind of looks. But then now it feels like you're beating around the bush in terms of what we need for resistance. And I think we need to talk about this a lot more. There's the work of Christophe Bonnel, who says if we don't achieve civil insurrection in this circumstance, we will all die. We are heading towards a very catastrophic situation, but we are not dead yet, and we won't be dead if we can free ourselves enough to revolt. So are we going to, and how? So we need to start talking about that, or we can just sit around and be fatalistic about it. So I think we need to mobilize some conversation about what those resistances look like.
But I think you're absolutely right, and it does call for action. And in the book, we do argue that decolonizing data is possible. What concerns me is the role that we play because I think it's productive to think of ourselves as rebels. But speaking for myself, I'm concerned about how complicit I'm in all of these processes. And that's why at the end I talked about the role of the native informant. Because I think also when we talk about these issues, many people say, I don't feel colonized, I don't feel oppressed, you know, maybe I don't read the terms of use, but it's okay, I'm getting something out of this relationship. And so that's why I started thinking about this particular role of the native informant. Even if we don't see ourselves as colonized subjects, I think we do need to see ourselves as native informants, as participants in this process, as people who have entered a particular bargain, sort of realized the historical moment that we live in, and we are complicit. Yes, I don't use Facebook, but I rely on Google and I use Amazon. And so I think that speaks to the possibilities and impossibilities of resistance as well. And I think we need to be perfectly clear-eyed about it.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for saying that. And also actually on the being a native informant, fun fact, I used to work inside a big tech company and I completely felt like a mole, like I'm here to tell you the true stories. But I guess on the subject of revolt and resistance, I feel like that's incredibly important and that's why it should be said in this forum. But I feel actually simultaneously like the problem is actually so big that revolt is not the only option. Once we revolt, what are we going to do? And so for me, like the practices that I've personally chosen to invest in look a lot more like dropping out and building alternatives. And I also think that there's the strategy of being critical from within. And I think that it's the scale of the problems that we confront are so large, actually, that all strategies are required. So that's just my personal perspective.
I think the data, just to respond to it, data workers union, data cooperatives, data commoning, like projects like this still are, while not necessarily brand new, are still very, very virgin, very emergent, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I think that they are fruitful and useful futures and present endeavours in a way. I think that the DIY community network movement, there's a resurgence there as well in terms of, you know, a sort of radical localization of data pools in a sense, and data streams that will also be kind of coming from communities, community dashboards, and these are approaches that I think that are actually quite useful in a sense in terms of really practically thinking about how to manage corpuses of data in a collective manner, and that I would hope that they would sort of kind of continue. Just to give you a very clear example, I work in Bristol. There's a local community network that's been running for 20 years, similar to the Fryfunk one. I've just sort of inherited it, in a sense, that question of inheritance, the question of legacies of these projects that were initiated when the first wave of the net kind of came in, let's say 94, early 2000, and kind of got sucked in and subsumed. We can go back in there and kind of reclaim some of those things. So reclaiming territory, you know, in the kind of like physical sense of the network as well is kind of interesting tactic as well.
Yes, hi. Also on the topic of resistance strategies, I was thinking about the concept that by the Invisible Committee in this book they wrote to our friends, which was about the places of power, and they were effectively saying nowadays the places of power are not like the court of law or the parliament, but rather the infrastructures of society. And then, so when we're talking about the empires of the cloud and the cities' data centers, and I imagine, okay, these are somehow the real palaces of power of these empires, and So my question is, what would it take, what actions should we take to kind of also make real, like not only maybe us or the people who know and study these topics and this phenomena, make people aware that those places that are hurricane-proof are also where power resides. And I mean, I would also be very curious to see what would happen if people would try to squat a data center, for example, or these kind of things. You know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think they are, data centers are the sites of power. I like how you put that. And I think they are only in so much as the big tech companies and, you know, their affordances are the sites of power. The sort of the material infrastructure of the data center is just an extension of where we locate that power, I think, in some sense. But I'm thinking of one example of resistance in particular was when the NSA data center opened up in Utah and activists actually tried to cut off the water supply in Utah so that they couldn't cool their servers with the water, and they'd use a precedent for the Yucca Mountain. It was sort of like for a similar kind of tactic from activists who were fighting against the disposal of nuclear waste. So I don't totally remember the link, but I know that they had borrowed that tactic. It was something about who sort of owns those waterways, who owns those particular lands for disposal. So there were activists, and it was called something like turn off the water, turn off the tap. And in fact, if you were to block off the water to a data center, because most of them are located near to, you know, these, whether it's for hydropower or for water for cooling their servers, if you sort of cut off their access to this kind of immediate environment that they rely on, they can't operate, right? So that's one sort of, I think, it didn't work, but I think it was quite clever and could have worked, you know, it wasn't completely out there. So I don't know, I think that that's one good example. The other thing, the flip side to that maybe is these data centers generally, if I think of the data center up in Luleå in Sweden, there's a really giant wall around it, so I don't know that you would just kind of go in and get very far. They're very protected. They're kind of these fortresses, and so they're difficult. Except, you know, they're not so difficult, I think, to access from up above. And it's not like I want to sit here and give people ideas about how to like destroy these data centers, but I think there's different ways of sort of imagining infiltrating them. And we I don't know. I don't know. Does anyone else have ideas?
Well, there was an article a little while ago that was called "Can We Blow Up the Internet?" Which interviewed Ingrid Burrington, who's I think you know her work, maybe we all do. She writes about the internet a lot. So you might read it. Also, if anyone ever offers you a tour of a data center, like, take it. It's so weird. But in terms of how we make them more visible, I just wanted to. The article is a very interesting read in terms of these types of resistance tactics. Basically, it's about how hard it is. It's not as easy as you might think. Taking out one data center is not going to do it. And indeed, actually, like, maybe this is completely old news, but the internet was designed for this problem. The internet protocols were designed to withstand wars. Yeah.
I guess I would just say that sites like the data center are very important, and that we look at them. But we should also realize that the sites of data colonialism are everywhere. And you know, when we really think about decolonizing space and time, those are the most immediate dimensions. And it starts with the space and time of the self and of the body. And I'm encouraged to see how in many cities, at least in some politicians are starting to, for instance, talk about blocking facial recognition. And usually these are legislations that are happening at the city level, because of course we know that right now, you know, we cannot depend on the federal government to take decisive action. A lot of these modes of resistance are starting in cities and smaller demographic populations. So I think that's where we need to also turn our attention, not just to the hidden sides, but to the immediate day-to-day experiences of colonization of our own bodies and times.
Solveig, I was wondering if you would like to comment on that, based on some of the examples of resistance that you are discussing in your current work and in your upcoming work, probably, Geocinema. It's not the work, I don't know if the work is released. If you would like to bring some of this knowledge now and comment on that.
I think like the immediate thing that sprung to mind, especially when you spoke about resistance in that sense in space and time, was exactly when I was interested in logistics, right? And also with a lot of really amazing feminist academics who speak about logistics, like Deborah Cowan or Charmaine Chua. You know, they speak about logistics as beyond serving something like an industrial capitalism that can exceed into, you know, how do we organize amongst ourselves, how do we organize in order to support community, or also even how to strategically blockade. For example, in London, there's this effort called End Deportations, where they literally block deportation airplanes of like an inherently racist system. Or strategies of just even more modest things like everyday maintenance of a certain structure. But other things, decolonizing time and space. I think maybe more about narratives and aesthetics. So Asia Bazareva, who is my collaborator for Geocinema, we've just been kind of really interested in the digital Belt and Road, which is the big Earth data counterpart to the Belt and Road. And here we've come across, I guess, just a lot of, again, the notion of unpicking a hegemonic narrative, of also, you know, taking or looking through or sifting through things like satellite imagery or surveillance cameras and seeing how we can kind of just decouple that from the original usage of it and actually bring it into even just something like a film or a documentary practice. I guess I can speak about it later as well.
Oh, I just thought that also, you know, as we talk about how we might move away from the internet as we know it and the problems of data centers and extractive big tech companies, it might also be useful to remember the ways that doing that is problematic. So sometimes activist groups at our networks, for example, we had a panel with people doing a number of different types of grassroots activism about how they use technology, and they were like, you all are invested in building like alternatives to Facebook, but our entire user base and all the people we want to reach as activists are on Facebook. We have to use Facebook. There's like a dialogue to be had maybe about the ways that pulling out of these platforms is a bad activist tactic for certain people. And maybe similarly, like we have the companies that operate large data centers. In some ways, they're in a so some tactics you might use if you're running an application and you want to reduce the energy use of your application. Energy sort of peaks, energy demand peaks around the world at different times. So you can route traffic to servers where, geographically speaking, it's nighttime and the demands on the energy grid are quite low. But doing that requires that your hosting services be provided by a company that is global or big. A small local host can't kind of do that kind of thing to reduce the energy load of your application. So there are all these sort of like problematic junctures where there's no real easy path at all.
It's just something that's come to mind, really. It's not so much a resistance strategy tactic, but it's maybe something that is a hopeful presentation from the sort of philosophical lines like new materialism and ecofeminist critical theory, where this sort of, you know, the idea of the liveliness of matter and the thingingness of the world and our essentially interdependence upon all other living systems. Some legal scholars are looking towards how that notion, in a sense, also shifts notions of property and personhood, and that from that theoretical perspective, that we're in a transitory shift at the moment, which I think is actually quite an interesting cut into this kind of conversation, in a sense, about how those legal frameworks which have underpinned capitalism, in a sense, are actually sort of being eked at the moment. And I think that that's kind of quite an interesting mind frame to step into. And I'm thinking specifically of my colleague Anna Greer at Cardiff University, who I'm working with in some of those kind of notions of what happens when that anthropocenic thinking comes into legal frameworks and the outcome of that. I mean, I think it decenters human privilege, which is basically what has been underlining all of this, and it kind of echoes then Haraway's call, in a sense, for kind of a responsibility and working with limitations, in a sense, for where we're at. And I think that that's kind of useful, that we're in a period that we need to be working within limitations, because we've had this notion of, the cheap nature for so long, and that still pervades and dominates this kind of mind frame, so to speak. So I'm hopeful in that respect that actually there's a decolonization of expectation that's happening upon, what I have the right to own and what I have the right to be as a human, which I think is quite important.
I think there's one more question there.
Yeah, I just had a response about, sorry, okay, fine. To the picture of the egg being cooked. People are taking up slow travel, they're giving up flying, they're taking the train, but they're also questioning the emissions of even taking the trains or moving around to conferences like this, and suggesting that it could be replaced by large Zoom meetings. So how do we get that calculation in our heads? The difference between emissions, we know the difference between emissions of taking the plane and taking the train, but what about the emissions of doing that large Zoom meeting, maybe with 30 participants? How do we measure the amount of emissions we're then generating from these data centers as opposed to moving our own bodies to have that meeting?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. There's the work of Anne Pasek, who is dealing with this this question specifically, moving forward. So I'd encourage you to sort of follow her, track her work on that question. But I would say that it's a very hard thing to measure because the industry doesn't make this kind of data available. It still wants you to think that it's largely weightless, immaterial. It's not uncommon to see on the signature of emails, telling people, save some trees, don't print this off, just this email, so great, whatever. So I think we still are trying to measure up, sort of, or at least acknowledge the environmental impacts of data centers. But again, it's that question of, we're always concerned with individual use, and I think that that's still relatively a small fraction of that impact, right? And when we talk about the few stats that we have available, when we say, 6% of all data used today is active, the rest is in deep storage. Well, that includes, oil and gas, genomics, physics, like you name it, right? Everything's sort of encompassed into those statistics. So I think it is probably safe to say that doing conferences, by Zoom or by Skype have much less of an environmental impact than, what it takes to bring all of us here today. But I think that that's a very good question, and I think that, we lose a lot by also not meeting in person. So I think that, I wonder if those are the only two options sometimes, but I think that this is a great question for such large gatherings. And also, like, we might think maybe it makes more sense to bring, one speaker to many people rather than You know, there's just other models, and I think that's a good question for not necessarily just comparing those two, but rethinking the ways we want to get together. What work does that do? That might be lost if it's all done online, and or if we're in such a state of crisis that we require a little bit of that loss to make up for other things. But I love the question. I just don't have a much better answer than that right now.
There's some other closing comment, because I think we will need to close. Ulises, would you like to add something? No? For Teresa? No. Yeah, I think that the way we close kind of leaves open a big topic somehow, which brings us to the difficult word that is complicity, and the stance that we all take when we talk about resistance. Perhaps we can keep this in our minds as we go out for a coffee and continue the discussion there. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for your thoughts.